out how this works before I do anything. So, someone show me which...
Yeah, the clicker's there, Mark.
You have two green buttons here.
Big green triangle.
But it's not working. The button's not working. Okay, yeah, all right. Thanks. So, we are in the midst of a major pro-cannabis cultural shift. You might call it a surge in our society. And I think CBD, cannabidiol, has been a big part of that. Yet 10 years ago, very few people knew anything about CBD. It's not a well-known compound. It wasn't really part of the medical marijuana experience in California and Canada 10 years ago. Aside from a relatively small number of scientists, it really wasn't on anybody's radar. And yet today we have this huge explosion of interest in CBD. And now in California you can get CBD in gas stations, even though it's not technically legal to do that in California. And in that sense, it's not unusual. It's all over the country like that in the United States. So I think what I'd like to do is focus a little bit on the history, some of the current scientific and therapeutic developments, and also look at the legal situation. But when we first rediscovered some of these CBD-rich strains, as we called them back in 2009 in Northern California, we had a sense right away, because we knew about CBD from scientific literature, that this could have a major impact on the medical marijuana community and the medical marijuana experience. Not simply because CBD had a great deal of therapeutic potential, according to the extensive animal studies, preclinical work and some clinical work. But also we had a sense at the time that CBD, because it's non-intoxicating, because it's not psychoactive like THC, and I always add the like THC because CBD is a mood changer. It doesn't get you stoned, but it is a mood changer. It can be antidepressant, anti-anxiety, and so forth. But we suspected at the time that this could be a real game changer, in that it could help to liberate cannabis from the drug abuse paradigm. So right away we sensed back in 2009, the group that ended up forming Project CBD, that it could have a major influence, even above and beyond what it might do for someone therapeutically, that it can influence the social landscape as a whole. And I think our intuition has been borne out, although in some ways observing or watching as the whole CBD narrative has unfolded, well, it's been very exciting and amazing and remarkable. It's also been somewhat disconcerting in some ways too. Some things we didn't expect. So just to start now with the early history, and we're going to move through quickly because we don't have that much time, but CBD was first isolated from a hemp plant by Roger Adams, a University of Illinois scientist. And then in 1963, Raphael Mechoulam, the eminent Israeli chemist, he synthesized CBD, he elucidated its chemical structure. But at that time, there wasn't really a lot of research that followed. Most of the focus was on THC, if anything, because THC got you high, and that was the concern of, and that was the interest of most people. There was a little bit of research. Some in Brazil, for some reason, has always been ahead of the curve with CBD. In 1980, there was an interesting study that showed CBD had strong anti-seizure properties, but it was a relatively small number of people involved in that research, or focused on, and it didn't really go anywhere for some reason, even though it showed it had significant anti-seizure potential. A big breakthrough in 1988 when the CB1 receptor was discovered. Dr. Russo has talked about that. And that stimulated almost a great deal of research that would follow from this. Very, very exciting research would have major implications for medical science and how we understand human physiology and human biology. And that also triggered more interest in CBD. So a key study in 1998, this is a US government-funded study. It was published in the Procedure of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, so it's a very prestigious study. 4 authors, one of them was a Nobel Prize winner, a Nobel laureate, Julius Axelrod. And the study concluded that both CBD and THC were powerful antioxidants that had strong neuroprotective properties. This research has been misportrayed by, I think, some of the CBD hemp companies as having laid the basis for a patent on CBD. That's not the case. There is a U.S. government patent, 2003, based on the research into THC and CBD, not just CBD. So we should keep that in mind. And you might be familiar with this. Cannabinoids have been found, referring to THC and CBD, to have antioxidant properties, have particular application as neuroprotectants, for example, in limiting neurological damages following ischemic insults such as stroke and trauma, or in the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and HIV dementia. So that's the U.S. government speaking from one side of its mouth, and the other side of its mouth is this is a dangerous drug with no medical value. So here we have a study from 2016, published in the UK, Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, and it's talking about, again, the neuroprotective properties of cannabinoids. Research, again, based on CBD and other cannabinoids, and you can see in red, summarizing, cannabinoids protect neurons on the molecular level. Normal brain aging and neurodegenerative diseases are suppressed by cannabinoids. That's very powerful, sort of anti-aging. And yet it's been known for quite a while. This is a slide I have to give credit to Dr. Russo, based on a translation, a relatively recent translation of the ancient Chinese pharmacopoeia, in which, talking about medicinal hemp, you see protracted taking may make one fat, strong, and never senile. So somehow we're just catching up to the ancient Chinese. So there's a common theme here. So not to repeat too much what Dr. Russo said, but just to summarize quickly. So why does cannabis work? It's because we have plant cannabinoids that mimic the effects of, and augment the effects of endogenous cannabinoids, and endogenous cannabinoids are part of the endocannabinoid system. I'm not going to spend too much time on these slides. I want to get to CBD, but because CBD and THC interact with the endocannabinoid system in different ways. I won't repeat the things that Dr. Russo has said, so we'll skip to the next slide. The idea is that the endocannabinoid system is dysregulated in almost all disease states in one way or another. That dysregulation might be an expression of a deficiency, or it could be an expression of an excess, if you're dealing with obesity or certain inflammatory conditions, diabetes, liver diseases, heart diseases, and so forth. So moving along, I don't want to repeat again all the information, but three key components to keep in mind as we turn now to CBD. The receptors, cannabinoid receptors, the endogenous compounds that bind to these receptors, and then various proteins we have in the body that kind of modulate the level of the endogenous cannabinoids, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So now CBD in particular. CBD is known as a promiscuous compound because it does so many different things. According to a study published last year, the author was a Mayo Clinic doctor from Minnesota, eminent medical institution. He identified he said that CBD interacts with over 65 different targets in the brain and body. That was in 2017. You could probably add a half dozen more easily. That's because new discoveries are being made all the time. So when you take CBD, you're not just hitting one receptor and turning it on and off. So many different things are going on. So the key thing is that unlike THC, CBD has little direct binding affinity for the cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2, but CBD does bind to many different receptors other than the cannabinoid receptors. And CBD also acts through many different receptor-independent channels or pathways. So looking at some of the receptors that CBD binds to, one of the key ones is the serotonin receptors, 5-HT1A, a receptor that mediates experience of anxiety, nausea, and so forth. CBD binds very powerfully to this receptor. I might add that CBDA, the raw version of CBD, before it's actually heated and or decarboxylated, that actually has a more potent affinity for this particular receptor. Interestingly enough, CBD also binds to the serotonin 5-H2A receptor, the same receptor that LSD and psilocybin bind to. Now, I think there's a panel on psychedelic medicine later I'll talk more about that and what the significance is on that panel. CBD binds to many receptors in what's called the TRP family of receptors, TRP, TRPV. There's a whole bunch of these, TRPV1, TRPV2, TRPV3, and so forth and so on. And these receptors mediate a very kind of primal sensory type of experiences. This is a very ancient receptor system that seems to be sort of overlaps and intertwines with the endocannabinoid system. And one thing that scientists found recently is that CBD downregulates genes that are linked to Alzheimer's via this TRPV1 receptor. By binding to it, it's changing gene expression of the gene linked to Alzheimer's. Just an example of what scientists are finding. Then you have PPAR receptors. These are receptors that are on the surface of the nucleus of the cell, not on the outside as the other receptors I just mentioned. CBD binds to one of the PPARs, also very significant therapeutic implications of that. That can regulate gene expression and so forth. Then there's many orphan receptors that we read about in the scientific literature. We hear about new ones every year. GPR, coupled protein receptor, and they have different numbers attached to them, and they do different things. And CBD, it turns out, binds to many of these receptors. And GPR55 was identified a few years ago already, and it's involved in regulating bone density. When GPR55 is activated, it's associated with cancer cell proliferation. CBD is an antagonist, meaning it binds to this receptor GPR55 but blocks it, which might be one of the ways that CBD has an anti-cancer effect. And you have other receptors. I mentioned the glycine receptor here. The point is there are a lot of different receptors that CBD is interacting with. Curiously, not the cannabinoid receptor, at least not directly like THC. So there's other neurotransmitters that CBD interacts with that influences levels of these neurotransmitters. GABA-A, it's interesting, we have, GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter. And what CBD does, it makes the GABA-A receptor function more powerfully or better. So when you take CBD, your own GABA will have more of an effect. So that's one way that CBD might have an anxiolytic or an anxiety-reducing effect. Because the GABA receptor, that's where Valium hits, that's where alcohol and so forth. It will relax you if that's activated. There's also the mu and delta opioid receptors that CBD interacts with. Adenosine, very important compound. And CBD is a reuptake inhibitor. I'll explain that in a moment. Also, it acts the same way for endocannabinoids. By reuptake inhibition, we mean that it will delay the breakdown and the reuptake of adenosine and also of endogenous cannabinoids. And that's a really cool and very interesting area that I want to focus on for a moment. Because in 2009, scientists from Stony Brook University in New York discovered that the endogenous cannabinoids, particularly anandamide, are transported by certain molecules that are called fatty acid binding proteins. And endogenous cannabinoids are like the plant cannabinoids. They're fatty, they're lipids, they're oily, they're sticky, if you will. And you know, that doesn't mix too well with blood because blood is watery. So how does it work that our endogenous cannabinoids get to where they need to go or do what they need to do? It's because they hitch a ride on these transport molecules called fatty acid binding proteins. So you can think of it kind of almost like a little canoe that takes these, where it takes it is through the cell membrane, inside the cell, where you also have an aqueous interior, where the endogenous cannabinoids do lots of important, interesting things until they're broken down and decommissioned inside the cell. Well, in 2015, the same group of scientists at Stony Brook, New York, discovered that these same fatty acid binding proteins are not only carriers of endogenous cannabinoids, but of plant cannabinoids. So what does this mean? Well, because the CBD in particular, which tends to be taken in higher doses than THC, so I'll talk about CBD in this context. You have limited space in that little canoe, and CBD is sort of gets first privilege, as you would. So if there's a competition in terms of getting a space on that fatty acid binding protein between CBD and an endogenous cannabinoid, CBD gets on. And so it displaces or it prevents the endogenous cannabinoids from going inside the cell to do what they need to do to be conditioned. So it delays the decommissioning or deactivation of the endogenous cannabinoids. And what that means is they're hanging around the brain longer. And the more endogenous cannabinoids are in the brain, the more receptors are going to be signaling in a way that has generally health positive benefits. So whenever you smoke weed, whenever you take pure CBD or a mixture or an oil, you are in essence, potentially at least, activating your own endogenous cannabinoids when you're doing that as well. So that's part of the experience. And I think that's enhancing endocannabinoid tone via reuptake inhibition may be a key mechanism whereby CBD and THC confer neuroprotection and other health benefits by boosting our own cannabinoids. And this is an area it's kind of a hot area now in cannabinoid science, because another thing that's been learned is that these fatty acid binding proteins, there's over a dozen different ones, and they're all specific to different areas of the body. So if a scientist can create a compound that essentially does what CBD does, that displaces the endogenous cannabinoid, will raise the level of the endogenous cannabinoid as a result. But they can do so targeting specific areas of the body, which you can't really do. When you smoke marijuana, it's a full-on assault or a pleasure, or whatever. And the same thing with other ways that scientists have been looking at it. If you can somehow adjust the levels of the cannabinoids in the body, well, you can have greater health effects if you can boost your endogenous cannabinoid tone. But it lacks specificity. So if you focus in this area, there's some real interesting potential for pharmaceutical development here. And I'm not a big fan of big pharma, but we should recognize that there's some value here. And the other thing, because we're talking about cell membranes and passing through the cell membrane, that means that the quality of the cell membrane, the health of the cell, is it too rigid, is it too porous, is it too permeable, will have a key impact on this whole phenomenon. And diet, this is all about diet and the diet we eat. And cholesterol is a very important element in the cell membrane. So it's something to keep in mind. Healthy fats are really, really key, the omega-3s and so forth for healthy membranes. So artisanal CBD, we've been talking about the science a little bit. Let's talk about the grassroots. As I mentioned, I don't know if I did mention, but we rediscovered some of these strains in Northern California in 2009 initially. And these early strains that we rediscovered were generally what is called now the type 2 cultivars. We don't speak so much in terms of indica sativa these days. We speak in terms of type 1, high THC, low CBD, type 2, mixed, type 3, high CBD, low THC. So initially the strains that were discovered were the type 2 mixtures, very interesting strains. Also eventually the ACDC is that type 3, high CBD, low THC. In some ways it's a bit unfortunate because that's kind of got a lot of the attention because people are growing these plants now basically to harvest them for CBD oil. And I think we are missing some real valuable opportunities with these type 2 strains, these very interesting blends of CBD and THC together, which are 1-to-1, 3-to-2, or whatever in ratios, depending on when you harvest it. But because there's been so much interest in CBD per se, I think we'll have to return to those plants because there's a lot of value there. Big change, a big tipping point in 2013, the program on CNN that really lit everything up. It had a huge impact, certainly from our perspective in California, because all of a sudden CBD is in great demand, and it wasn't before really. It was limited within the medical marijuana milieu, and even just limited within that milieu itself. But all of a sudden, people are hearing about and seeing on TV these miraculous outcomes and this great deal of interest. And that combination of not intoxicating but great medicinal value was just irresistible for a lot of people. And it has spurred a huge increase in the number of folks interested in cannabis therapeutics. So I think this whole idea of healing without the high, the idea that CBD can neutralize THC psychoactivity, depending how much of each is in a given strain. While it's significant, I think in some ways it misses the point. Yes, it is important that people have options and can get cannabis products that aren't psychoactive like THC. That's very important to have that option. But what it's really all about is managing psychoactivity. Because from our perspective, without getting into every condition or every detail, you know, if you have both THC and CBD in a product, it'll probably help you. Probably. So it's a matter of just having both there, you know. But then the question is how much of each. And it's not so much a matter of, well, what's the right ratio for the condition? At least that's been our experience thus far in California. We don't match ratios to condition. We match ratios to what people are comfortable with. And the idea is as much THC along with the CBD that a person is comfortable with. That's what we focus on. So a person's sensitivity to THC is key. And the medical use of cannabis really depends, at least initially, to a large degree on managing its psychoactive properties. Interestingly, we just published a report yesterday on the Project CBD website, an extensive report on cannabinoids and drug interactions. And one of the things we learned from researching that, and this is available free, you can get it from projectcbd.org, you can download it. But it turns out that there are certain enzymes that CBD will interact with these enzymes are responsible for metabolizing many different drugs. It's the cytochrome P450 family. And people have different genetic variants of some of these enzymes. And certain of these enzymes will metabolize CBD, except there's genetic variants such that a person might have a polymorphism, for lack of a better word, maybe a mutation on this gene that encodes a enzyme that would normally metabolize CBD. Well, if there's something odd or off or unusual about that, such that a person doesn't metabolize the THC well, that's going to stay in their system a lot longer, and a person, it could be a key factor in explaining why some people just can't handle THC. They smoke it, and you've got to peel them off the ceiling. About 20% of Caucasians have a variant that would have that effect. There's actually two different enzymes that play into this. So, and in other people of African descent, a little less than 10% have this variant. Asians less than 5%, but Caucasians and Middle Eastern, about 1 out of 5, according to this, may have some real problems with THC, and underscores the importance of why CBD would be particularly appropriate for such a person. So moving on. What are we finding when we talk about artisanal CBD and people are just simply using it at the grassroots, either with the supervision of a doctor or not, the different kinds of products that one can get, topicals, ingestibles, the whole slew of different products that you get for high THC product, you can also get for CBD. Well, we all know about epilepsy and the dramatic effects it can sometimes have on children with these catastrophic seizure disorders. And CBD was just approved as a pharmaceutical in the United States for those conditions. But what we're seeing on the ground, where CBD is mainly being used, and our website has 50 different conditions, you could look at the preclinical science and a little bit of the clinical science. But the main conditions that we're seeing, pain, anxiety, and depression, that's what people are using CBD for, if you're talking about just sheer numbers. And also traumatic brain injury. CBD is a really great candidate for what is a very, very complex disease, traumatic brain injury, which resists treatment generally. But CBD, there's a lot there for people with these conditions, both for strokes and traumatic brain injury, as the federal government has acknowledged in the patent. And certainly football players in the United States, athletes are coming out saying this really does help. And but I think another area that's going to be huge in the near future is metabolic syndrome, diabetes, obesity. We at Project CBD, we hear from a lot of people that share their testimonials, as it were, with us. And we got a number of folks saying that when they started on a CBD regimen, and usually it's high CBD, low THC, they did before and after experiments looking at their blood sugar numbers, their insulin resistance numbers, And going on a CBD treatment regimen, 4 to 6 weeks, brings those numbers down in the right direction. And we've seen this now in a number of cases with people. So I think, and this is all, you might say, impressionistic and observational, except there are actually numbers and blood tests that we can look at. I think this is going to be huge in the future, given how widespread, because of Western diet, metabolic syndrome is. Also, people are using CBD and THC for cancer, and I think here is there's also great potential, and where we see from preclinical research and also anecdotal observations, is that CBD and THC combined with chemotherapy, combined with radiation, has a greater than 1+1 effect, that they really potentiate each other. So that CBD can make the chemotherapy stronger, meaning you can use less of it, which for these very highly toxic chemotherapy regimens, anytime you can use less to have the same effect as you would otherwise, that's a good thing. And CBD also has its own anti-tumoral properties combined with that, and it can just help the difficulties of going through chemotherapy. So that's another area that's very exciting, and that's part of this grassroots laboratory experiment democracy we see going on now with CBD and cannabis therapeutics. And finally, people are using it as a preventive, and I think it's legitimate. It's I don't know where this is all going, but people say it. How do they describe it? People want to describe, well, what's taking CBD? What is it like taking CBD? It's like having a really good day. That's what they say, which is what they say about LSD microdosing too. There's something there. But in any case, let's move on quickly. Impact of CBD. CBD has accentuated a national and international pro-cannabis cultural shift. CBD has shifted the public discussion about medical cannabis from whether it works to how to use it for maximum therapeutic benefit. CBD in the United States, the backward country that I'm from, has catalyzed the rebirth of the U.S. Domestic hemp industry. We are a backward country. Hemp is not yet really legal in the United States. Industrial hemp, growing it might be soon. But also hemp, CBD, colossal big dollars, and that's a whole other thing. They're predicting $22 billion CBD industry by the middle of the next decade. One of these, I think, the Brightfield group. So there's a lot going on here. There's huge consumer demand for CBD. What about hemp CBD? Well, in 2014 in the United States, they passed a farm bill which defined hemp legally for the first time as a cannabis plant where no part of the plant exceeded greater than 0.3% THC. Unfortunately, they didn't define what part meant, so probably there's no hemp plants in the world like this, because you probably have some hemp plant with the trichome that's more than 0.3% THC. That is a part, but I don't want to get too technical here. The point is that the Farm Bill in the United States did not actually legalize hemp or CBD. All it really did was create a temporary exemption so that state licensed farmers in certain states that would legalize the growing of it could grow it on an experimental basis. Now that experimental basis does not say commercial use, but they use that loophole, the hemp growers, to really drive a huge fleet through it. So you have commercial growing, and it comes down to really whether it's a matter of interpretation, because it doesn't specify that hemp could be grown experimentally for commercial use, but it doesn't say it can't. So if you want to see it one way, you can say it's legal to grow for commercial use according to the Farm Bill. If you want to see it, letter of the law kind of thing, then it's like, no, it's not. And you can argue about the interpretation. The problem here is that the Controlled Substances Act in the United States from 1970 still exists, and it says that anything extracted from the resin of the plant is illegal, and that's where CBD comes from, the resin. So you can interpret all you want, but as long as the Controlled Substances Act still exists, we've got a big problem. And we can talk a little more about where I think this is going, because another farm bill will be passed probably by the end of the year, which will actually legalize growing of industrial hemp in the United States. So despite DEA and FDA approval, unregulated hemp CBD commerce proliferates throughout the United States. So here's some images here. You can see on the left, that's hemp, industrial hemp grown for fiber. You know, hemp is a tremendous plant. We honor hemp, so many different uses. There you see almost looks like bamboo. And then next to that is hemp grown for the seed oil. The seed oil also has many industrial uses. It's very nutritional, omega-3s and so forth. That's what you see in second from the left. And then far to the right, that's cannabis plants, what we call marijuana plants, right? Now, what is in the middle there? What does that look like, the one second to the right? Those plants, they look like industrial hemp, does it look like marijuana? Marijuana is the flower tops of high resin cannabis. Industrial hemp is low resin cannabis. Marijuana, high resin cannabis. Well, what does that look like, the Kentucky CBD? Is that hemp or marijuana? We call it hemp wink wink. Because it's not really, it's high resin plants, and what they're doing in Colorado, Oregon, Kentucky, they're growing the same plants that we grow in California, where they don't have to worry, at least up to this point, about getting this absurd, THC level and making sure it meets that level. What they do is they grow plants that, if they were grown to full maturity, would exceed that 0.3% THC level, so they harvest them early to keep the THC level down. Unfortunately, that means you're also minimizing or lessening the CBD content. So in California, we have plants that grow 20% CBD by dry weight and a little over 1% THC. That's a great source for CBD if you're growing it to harvest the oil. This will all become moot because eventually these plants are being bred so that you'll have high resin marijuana plants that meet the legal definition of THC. And that definition of 0.3% THC, there is no scientific basis to this. This is really kind of an absurd line. That means 0.4% THC, it's illegal, 0.3% THC. It's just crazy. And it's what it is in a way of extending prohibition in another name. So pharmaceutical CBD, there's been some very important developments. Of course, together pharmaceuticals, Epidiolex is approved in the United States as a pharmaceutical for treating catastrophic seizure disorders, certainly. And I welcome this development. I think this is really great. I think that whatever helps the person, we should have access to it. Yesterday, we learned that the DEA has scheduled Epidiolex as Schedule 5, which is the lowest possible in the schedule. Schedule 6 would be non-scheduled. Schedule 1 is where cannabis and CBD are still at. That's considered dangerous with no medical value. What will happen next? Will DEA remove CBD from Schedule 1? It's not clear. They don't have to, because the law says anything from the resin is illegal. So they can just say, well, we're just following the law. And that's probably what they will say, according to what we're picking up our ear to the ground. You'll have this confusing legal situation that will persist for a while in the United States. There's very interesting research being done with single molecule CBD, which has shown some significant potential for psychosis, although there's been other studies that have come through less clearly. But in Germany, there's been some very interesting research that showed basically that CBD, pure single molecule CBD, was as effective as the standard antipsychotic drugs without the harmful side effects. So that's an improvement right there. There was some recent research published at Yale University also looking at schizophrenics, CBD, pure CBD. It didn't turn out quite as well, but I think there's a compelling case to be made that single molecule CBD, even though my personal bias is toward the plant, can be useful. It's being shown with Epidiolex and the clinical trials that yes, it can be useful and it can work, and we should recognize that. Example of some other interesting research with single molecule CBD that was just presented earlier this summer at the International Cannabinoid Research Society. Graft versus host disease, when you get an organ transplant or even sometimes a broken blood transfusion, oftentimes the body tries to reject the organ. In acute cases of that, it's usually fatal, like 80%, and there's no medical technology to help that. The study that was previewed or featured at the ICRS conference recently showed remarkable success with single molecule CBD in preclinical work. with graft versus host. So I think, anytime you can develop something out of any aspect of the cannabis plant that fulfills a medical need, I'm all for it, and I'm putting down my favoritism toward the plant. If it helps a human being, go for it. So that's how I feel. So now, how do we compare pharmaceutical versus artisanal CBD? I think they both have their place, but pure CBD products lack critical medicinal terpenes and minor cannabinoids which interact with CBD and THC to enhance their therapeutic benefits. That's key. At Project CBD, we are not against THC at all. We emphasize that CBD and THC should be seen as sort of like the power couple of cannabis therapeutics. They really belong together. They accentuate each other's medical benefits. And if you're using just single molecule pharmaceutical CBD, obviously the THC is not there unless you're using single molecule THC, which is legal in the United States. It's a Schedule III drug, as marijuana. So animal studies and anecdotal data indicate that whole plant CBD-rich oil is effective at lower doses and has a wider therapeutic window than CBD isolates. Meaning you need less CBD when it's part of the whole cannabis matrix to be effective, and it's easier for it to be effective than with single molecule CBD. At least in some of the studies that we've seen, you need a very high dose and a very precise dose for it to be effective in these studies. So that's an important comparison. The other thing is with CBD isolates, that's where we see some problems with drug interactions. And this is a report we just put out on CBD, cannabinoid drug interactions, and I'll kind of give you the spoiler alert for it. It's a lengthy report, like 35 pages, single space. It's a very serious deep dive we took into this, because we knew this is going to come up. Doctors who are not involved with cannabis therapeutics are going to be dealing with patients who are, and their doctors and patients need to know if there's going to be any issues with drug interactions. Well, at sufficient dosages, the CBD will temporarily either deactivate or induce these cytochrome P450 enzymes, thereby altering how we metabolize a wide range of compounds, including many pharmaceuticals and THC. Cytochrome P450 enzymes metabolize most of the drugs we consume, including more than 60% of marketed pharmaceuticals, meaning that there's a potential interaction here with CBD. Patients on a CBD treatment regimen should monitor changes in blood levels of prescription medications and, if need be, adjust dosage. We didn't see problems with drug interactions in just cannabis flower, even high CBD cannabis flower. We don't know of any problematic drug reactions with Marinol, pure THC. Why? Well, you don't take these massive doses of Marinol. 10 milligrams of THC is enough to get you nice and high. But with CBD, they're taking really high doses, and because of the dosage, that's where you can get into the problems with the drug interactions. With THC, they're kind of like these guardrails. You bump into it. When you've taken too much THC, you know it, and it's not all that much fun. There's a kind of dysphoria that can set in. Well, with CBD, there's no dysphoric guardrails to tell you when you've had too much. And because people take it in large amounts, at least in some cases, that's where the potential for drug interactions could be problematic. But drug interactions doesn't mean you should forego other medications if you're using cannabis. Cannabis and CBD can work synergistically with conventional medications, but patients need to be aware of potential side effects. And we see it with chemotherapy, a potential positive interaction there if the levels of the chemotherapy agent are being monitored, because with CBD, if it inhibits the enzyme that metabolizes the chemotherapy agent, the chemotherapy will stay in the system longer and it can accumulate, and that can be very dangerous. So these things have to be looked at seriously. We've seen other situations with blood thinners where there are potential problems with single molecule CBD therapies and for people who are on blood thinners. But it's also very easy to just monitor it and change the levels of the blood thinners if you need to. So, see, this is, we're getting to the end here, CBD at the crossroads. Will DEA reschedule CBD? We don't know. I have a feeling this is not going to happen right away. We have a farm bill that was supposed to have been passed by now, a 2018 farm bill. It's been delayed because I guess I guess they're too preoccupied with putting a sexual predator on the Supreme Court to deal with the Farm Bill right now. So it's been pushed back a couple of months. And this Farm Bill would bring the United States into the family of nations and legalize the growing of industrial hemp for, among other things, biomass to extract CBD from. But what happens after that, that gets confusing. There's going to be a lot of hemp wink-wink grown in the United States. There already is in Oregon, Kentucky, Vermont. Montana is the state that's going to really emerge as the big CBD hemp state in the United States, I believe. I think one of the problems with the focus on the CBD for harvesting the oil and the regulatory privileging of single molecule CBD is that it kind of pushes things in a direction of, it kind of limits genetic diversity. I return to this whole idea of those type 2 plants that we were discovering early on 10 years ago that were so interesting and wonderful. They kind of just sort of fall to the waste. And people aren't really focusing on them very much because there's such a strong push for CBD, CBD, CBD. And I think that whole, what's happening with, the legalization of industrial hemp will result in a kind of monocropping for CBD, which sort of limits, it's not a direction I think you want to go in, really. But certainly you want to grow a lot of plants for CBD, but I don't like the idea of losing the genetic diversity that we have. What we do have is sort of promiscuous interbreeding, which led us to rediscover the CBD strains in the first place. So CBD only, if it turns out that CBD becomes legal in the United States, the rest of the plant isn't, which I think is a really stupid way to go, although some people think it's, one step at a time, and incrementally you get to ending cannabis prohibition. But I think with CBD only, you have a legal quagmire. So you grow industrial hemp. You grow it for biomass, you extract the oil and you concentrate it. When you concentrate an extraction, it raises the level of what's in there. So if you start out with a plant that's 10% CBD and maybe 0.2% THC, so it's legally industrial hemp, you concentrate it, both the levels will increase so that you'll have more than 0.3% THC in your concentrate. So that means that the product maker will then have to remove some of the THC to bring the product to market. So somewhere along the process, they're breaking federal and state law. So that's what you're going to have as a result of it. It's going to be a legal quagmire. I don't think CBD only is really workable in terms of enforcing it, either in theory or practice, but that's what we have. Finally, and it's not workable because, it's built on a lie. The Controlled Substances Act is built on a mountain of lies. Marijuana prohibition is a racist policy. And I compare ongoing marijuana prohibition to the Confederate statues still standing. It's there, it's ugly, it should be put in a museum, and the same thing with cannabis prohibition. I think I made my point. So, one other point to make, 10 years ago, the drive toward marijuana legalization, the motivating factor was really social justice. So people shouldn't be unjustly discriminated against, jailed, and so forth. And we know the laws were targeted against ethnic minorities since the get-go. So that was the driving force initially for legalization, justice. Now the driving force is business, and that's different. It's a big change. One doesn't have to comment on the change, really, but it's just a change, and we should be aware of it. So finally, take-home messages. Vilifying either holistic herbal medicine or modern medicine is not helpful. Both approaches are valuable. People are best served by having access to a wide range of cannabinoid-based therapeutic options, and regulatory policy should not privilege single-molecule cannabinoids over whole plant cannabis remedies. So finally, more information, projectcbd.org. There's a lot of resources there. Smoke Signal's my book. And finally, thanks to Cannabidiol, which is a cannabis business in California that supports some of our work at Project CBD. And very last but not least is a picture of Emerald Farms, and that's why I'm here, because it's true what Solomon said. And on that note, big round of applause for Solomon, who's such a wonderful person to work with. We do a lot of public speaking at Project CBD. We get a lot of invitations, and I can say there is no one more pleasant, more on the dime to deal with than Solomon. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Martin. We always love your talks so much. Such a mixture. Yeah. Such a beautiful mixture of heart and science. I oftentimes say government is missing science, science is missing spirit, and spirit can always have more love, and Martin always shows that. Thank you so much.